I think I didn't do anything wrong. Just let two men settle things like men do. My new boyfriend punched my husband in front of everyone at dinner, and I laughed because I thought he deserved it. But when the laughter faded, my husband's revenge wasn't with fists. It came in the form of a lawyer's envelope that ended everything. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I still don't think I did anything wrong. I mean, it was dinner, not war. I thought we were being adults about it. I thought Thomas needed to see that I'd moved on, that someone else could give me what he couldn't. Damon was supposed to be proof of that. We were supposed to eat, talk about closure, maybe sign some papers. But then Damon punched him, and I laughed. I laughed so hard the waiter froze. I didn't even realize then that the sound of it would haunt me. That laugh echoing through the restaurant while Thomas just wiped the blood from his lip and stared at me like he was looking at a stranger. It started 2 weeks earlier, when I told Ruth I was done pretending. I said, "I'm not going to keep living like a ghost in that house. He's never affectionate, never says anything." She said, "Maybe he's just quiet." I said, "Quiet feels like rejection after 10 years. That's how it began, me convincing myself that silence was cruelty. Then Damon came along. He worked near my bookshop, confident, loud, always smiling. He flirted like it was breathing. The first time he walked in, he picked up a travel guide and asked me where I'd go if I could leave everything behind. I said, "Anywhere." He said, "Then you should." It felt like permission. We started seeing each other after work. Coffee first, then dinners, then weekends when I said I was working late. He made me feel visible again. I started talking about him to Ruth, not in detail, just hints. She didn't stop me. She said, "Everyone deserves to feel alive." The guilt didn't hit me until Thomas found one of Damon's texts. It wasn't explicit, just obvious. He didn't yell. He just stared at me for a long time, then said, "You could have just told me." That calm voice made me furious. I said, "Told you what? That I'm tired of being invisible?" He said, "Then leave." I said, "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" He said, "I'd like honesty." That night I messaged Damon and told him I wanted Thomas to see what he'd lost. Damon said, "You want a show? I can give him one." I thought he meant confidence, not violence. I booked a table at Marino's, Thomas's favorite place, pretending it was for a final conversation. I told him Damon would be there, that we could all talk maturely. He said fine, in that same quiet tone that made everything sound like a trap. When we arrived, the tension was already alive in the air. Marino's was half full, candles flickering between wine glasses. I'd worn a red dress Damon said made me look powerful. Thomas wore his usual black jacket, the one I always said made him look like a widower. I wanted to show him what real energy looked like. I wanted him to see what he'd lost. Damon was already at the table, smiling wide. He stood to shake Thomas's hand, too firm, too forced. Thomas just nodded and sat. The waiter came, took our orders, and left in a hurry. I could feel the table vibrate with unspoken things. Damon started the talking. He said Thomas should be proud that I finally found someone who treats her right. I winced a little but didn't stop him. Thomas didn't react. He just sipped his water. Damon kept going, saying how some men don't realize what they have until it's taken. Thomas finally said, "Nothing was taken. You can't steal something that left willingly." Damon smirked and leaned back. I felt heat rise in my chest. I said, "He's not wrong, Thomas. You gave up on me first." He looked at me then, not angry, just sad. "You stopped giving me anything to hold on to," he said. I rolled my eyes and said, "I gave you chances to change. You just never took them." The silence after that felt sharp. I tried to fill it by laughing, saying, "At least this dinner proves we're all adults, right?" Damon laughed with me, but it sounded meaner than I expected. Then Damon said something I'll never forget. He looked Thomas straight in the eye and said, You ever wonder what she looks like when she's happy? Thomas didn't move. His jaw tightened slightly. I felt a strange thrill, a mix of power and shame. I wanted him to react. I wanted him to finally fight for me. Instead, he said softly, "You should both go." That's when Damon lost it. He slammed his hand on the table, stood up, and before I could say anything, his fist connected with Thomas's face. The sound was shocking, dull, heavy. People gasped. A glass fell and shattered. Thomas stumbled back in his chair but didn't fall. He just touched his lip, wiped the blood, and looked at Damon, then at me. I laughed. I don't know why. Maybe to hide the panic. Maybe because part of me wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. But that laugh filled the room, bounced off the walls. Even Damon froze. Thomas stood slowly, reached for his wallet, and placed 100 on the table. His voice was calm, steady. "We're done," he said. "Both of you." Then he looked at me and added, "You just gave me everything I needed." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already walking away. The restaurant buzzed with whispers. Damon tried to follow him, but the waiter blocked the way. Lydia arrived just then. She'd been invited by Thomas to witness what he thought would be a peace talk. She took one look at him leaving, blood on his lip, and then at me laughing beside Damon, and her face turned to stone. She said, "You'll regret that laugh." I said, "He should have defended himself." She said, "No, Celia, he's defending himself right now. You just don't see how." I didn't understand her until days later. That night, I went home smug, almost proud. Damon called me brave, said I handled it like a queen. But when I walked into the house, the bedroom closet was half empty. His suits, his laptop, his sketches, all gone. On the nightstand was his wedding ring and a small note. It said, "Silence isn't weakness, it's planning." I laughed again, but this time it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like something cracking open, quiet but deep. I tore the note in half and threw it in the bin. I told myself he was bluffing. He wouldn't actually leave. He wasn't the kind of man who acted, only the kind who endured. But when I called his phone, it went straight to voicemail. When I checked our joint account, half the money was gone. I poured wine, told myself it didn't matter, but for the first time, that silence, the same one I'd always mocked him for, didn't feel like distance. It felt like a warning. For the first few days, I told everyone it was nothing, a stupid argument that got out of hand. I even joked about it with Ruth on the phone, saying, "At least he finally showed some emotion, right?" She didn't laugh. She said quietly, "Celia, you humiliated him." I said, "Oh, please, he's fine. He's always fine." But she didn't answer after that. At work, people had already heard. Someone from Marino's must have posted about it online. A man punched another during dinner while his wife laughed. No names, but people guessed. The bookshop felt smaller than ever. Customers looked at me like I was a story they'd already read. Dana, my assistant, stopped asking how I was. She just nodded politely and avoided eye contact. Damon, on the other hand, was loving the attention. He kept saying things like, "Everyone finally sees how strong we are," and "He'll back off now." But Thomas didn't react. He didn't post, didn't call, didn't even try to defend himself. That silence made Damon nervous. It made me uneasy too, though I'd never admit it. One night, Damon asked if Thomas was going to press charges. I shrugged, pretending I didn't care. "He's too proud for that," I said. "He'll lick his wounds in silence." Damon laughed but didn't look convinced. I caught him checking his phone constantly for days after that. Then the first letter came. A plain white envelope addressed to Damon, not me. Inside was a police report. An assault complaint filed by Thomas Armitage. I found it in Damon's gym bag. When I confronted him, he looked furious. "Why would he do this?" he said. "You told me he's not that type." I said, "He's just trying to scare you." He said, "No, Celia, he's trying to bury me legally." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall. I didn't chase him. I just sat there staring at the shards of glass and thinking, maybe I'd underestimated Thomas. The next day, a second envelope arrived, this one for me. It was from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page. Notice of intent to divorce. The words blurred for a second as I read them. It wasn't angry or emotional, just factual. It listed Rachel West, Esquire, as his legal representative. I laughed out loud, half in disbelief, half to keep from crying. When I told Ruth, she said, "You should have expected it." I said, "He's being vindictive." She said, "He's being rational." That word made me snap. "Rational men don't file paperwork to destroy their families," I shouted. Ruth said quietly, "They do when you destroy them first." After that, she stopped calling for a while. I tried to talk to Lydia, but she wouldn't pick up. When she finally answered a week later, her voice was distant. She said, "Thomas doesn't want contact. He's working through the lawyer now." I said, "He can't just erase me." She said, "He's not erasing you, Celia. He's documenting you." Then she hung up. Those words kept replaying in my head. He's documenting you. I started noticing little things changing. Our joint account was locked. The mortgage payments were frozen. My work email received a notice from HR about inappropriate online conduct. They'd seen a comment I'd made under a post about repressed men who ruin good women. I deleted it, but it was too late. When Damon finally came back, he was different, paranoid, angry. He said he couldn't risk more legal trouble and told me I was on my own. "I don't need this kind of drama," he said. I told him he was pathetic and he walked out for good. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and stared at Thomas's wedding ring, still sitting on the nightstand. I'd left it there as some sort of joke, proof that I'd won. Now it looked like evidence against me. I called him once, just once. It went to voicemail. I said, "Thomas, we can talk about this like adults. You don't need to involve lawyers." The next morning, I got an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. A few days later, a courier arrived at the bookshop. He handed me another thick envelope. This one had my full name on it, Celia Armitage, respondent. Inside was a stack of documents: divorce petition, custody considerations, financial disclosure. It was all so organized, so calm. There were tabs, attachments, timelines. He'd been preparing. I called Ruth again. She said, "He's building his case, Celia." I said, "He's trying to humiliate me." She said, "No, you already did that yourself." At work, my manager pulled me aside and said the owners had received concerns from customers. She said it softly, almost apologetically, like she didn't want to make it worse. "Maybe take a few days off," she said. I told her I didn't need pity. She said, "It's not pity, it's prevention." I walked home that night past Marino's, the same restaurant where it all began. I stopped outside for a moment, staring at the window table we'd sat at. The scene replayed in my head. The punch, the silence, my laughter. I saw it clearly now from the outside, and it didn't look strong or clever. It looked cruel. When I got home, another message was waiting, this time from Rachel West herself. It was short. "Please cease direct contact with my client. All communication must be formal. Failure to comply will be noted." I stared at those words. Failure to comply will be noted. They sounded cold, almost robotic, but underneath them was something terrifying. Control. That night, I went through old photos of us. Birthdays, vacations, the housewarming party when we first moved in. In every picture, Thomas looked steady, calm, quiet. I used to call that boring. Now I saw it differently. It was focus, discipline. He'd always been planning, even when I thought he was passive. When I closed my laptop, I noticed something else. The Wi-Fi name had changed. It used to be Armitage Home. Now it was Thomas account. Somehow, even the house was claiming him, not me. The next morning, I found another letter under the door. Request for property valuation and financial audit. My lawyer hadn't even been hired yet. He was 10 steps ahead. I told myself it was fine, that I'd handle it. But as I sat there surrounded by envelopes and documents, I realized I'd underestimated him completely. The man I thought too quiet to fight back had found a way to dismantle me without ever raising his voice. And the worst part was, I'd given him every tool to do it, while laughing. By the third week, I was running on denial and caffeine. Every morning I woke up thinking maybe he'd stop this, maybe he'd miss me enough to drop the whole act. But the letters kept coming. Each one was colder, more official. My name looked smaller on every envelope, like I was disappearing line by line. I told Ruth that Thomas was overreacting. She said, "You're lucky he's not pressing criminal charges." I said, "For what? I didn't hit anyone." She sighed. "You laughed when someone did, Celia. In public." That sentence stuck to my ribs like ice. I tried to distract myself with work, but even the bookshop started to feel hostile. People stopped asking questions. Some whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. The manager called me into the office and said the owners wanted a written apology posted online to repair the store's image. I refused. I said, "I won't apologize for having feelings." She said, "It's not feelings you need to apologize for, it's judgment." The next day, I received a new email, this time from Rachel West's office. It contained a digital folder labeled Evidence, Primary Files. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were screenshots, dated messages, payment records, even a video clip from the restaurant's security camera. I clicked play. The footage showed Damon standing, the punch landing, the gasp of the crowd. Then me, throwing my head back and laughing. The audio caught it clearly. My voice sounded sharp, cruel, like it didn't belong to me. The clip ended with Thomas paying the bill and walking out, calm as ever. There was no chaos, just dignity and silence on his side, and hysteria on mine. I slammed the laptop shut. My hands were shaking. I wanted to call Rachel and tell her she had no right to keep that video, but I knew it was legal. It was evidence. That night, I went to Lydia's house. I didn't call first. I knew she wouldn't answer. When she opened the door, she looked tired, older somehow. "What do you want?" she asked. I said, "To talk to my husband." She said, "He's not your husband anymore. He's working late." I said, "You mean he's hiding behind lawyers?" She said, "He's protecting himself. You made his life a spectacle." I followed her into the kitchen without being invited. The smell of coffee filled the air. She sat down, folding her hands. "You've always mistaken silence for weakness," she said. "But do you know what silence really is? It's focus. He's been focusing for months." I said, "He was cold long before I ever looked elsewhere." She said, "No, Celia. You looked elsewhere instead of asking why you'd gone cold yourself." I stood up, angry. "He's turning everyone against me." She shook her head. "No one has to turn anyone. You're doing that all by yourself." I left before she could say more. When I got home, another email waited. Asset transfer confirmed. I opened it and froze. The house deed was now solely under his name. My access to the joint account was officially revoked. He'd moved faster than I thought possible. I tried calling the bank, insisting there must be an error, but the woman on the phone said, "All documentation is signed by both parties' counsel." "Both parties?" I asked. She said, "Your counsel submitted electronically last night." My heart stopped. I hadn't hired anyone yet. Then I realized Thomas must have appointed temporary representation on my behalf to expedite the process. He'd thought of everything, even my inaction. I poured myself a drink, trying to slow my breathing. The room felt smaller. I could still hear Lydia's voice. "He's been focusing for months. That weekend, Ruth came over. She brought wine and groceries, trying to act casual. She said, 'He's building a wall, Celia. Once it's up, you won't reach him again.' I said, 'Then I'll climb it.' She said, He doesn't live in the same world anymore. You're not on his map. We drank in silence for a while. Then she said, "Why did you really laugh that night?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe I thought laughter would keep me from looking cruel. Maybe I thought it made me powerful. But saying that out loud felt impossible. Later, when she went to the bathroom, I checked my phone. Another message from Rachel. Reminder of upcoming mediation. Attendance required. There was also a list of attachments. Custody evaluation forms, behavioral assessments, witness statements. When Ruth came back, she saw the look on my face. "He's taking Emmy?" she asked softly. I said, "He can't. I'm her mother." Ruth said, "You left her with your sister while you played house with Damon." I snapped, "That's not fair." She said, "Neither was laughing at her father in front of a crowd." She left soon after, saying she couldn't be part of this anymore. I stayed up all night, rereading the evidence file. Each document was like a nail sealing something shut. I kept looking for loopholes, inconsistencies, but there were none. Every line was factual, precise. There were even witness statements from Marino's staff describing me as unbothered and mocking. The next morning, I drove to Thomas's office. The receptionist looked startled when I walked in. "I just need 5 minutes," I said. She whispered something into a phone, then looked back at me. "Mr. Armitage isn't available." I said, "I'll wait." She said, "He doesn't work here anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked. She handed me a slip of paper, property transferred to Armitage Design LLC, new address pending. He'd moved the company too. Outside, I sat in the car and stared at the note. The man who'd once spent years building our life together had quietly dismantled every piece of it while I was too busy trying to humiliate him. When I got home, I found a plain envelope under the door. Inside was a single sentence written in his handwriting. "I told you silence was planning." My hands went numb. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to rip the note apart, but I couldn't. It was too precise, too final. That night, I called Damon out of desperation. His number had changed. His gym said he'd moved to another city. I realized, all at once, that both men had left. One because he was done pretending, the other because he'd never been real to begin with. I looked around the house that used to be ours. The furniture, the photos, the empty spaces where his things used to be. Everything looked the same, yet completely unfamiliar. I used to think revenge was loud, shouting, slamming doors, dramatic exits. But Thomas's revenge was quiet, steady, devastating. He didn't need to scream. He just erased me with paperwork, one signature at a time. And somehow, that hurt more than any punch ever could. By the time the mediation date arrived, I was barely keeping up the act. I told myself I'd walk in there calm, confident, maybe even charming enough to remind him of what we once had. I thought if I smiled just right or sounded remorseful enough, I could make him hesitate. Thomas always had a soft heart, didn't he? That's what I used to think, that I could bend him whenever I wanted. But when I saw him across the table that morning, surrounded by calm professionals and thick folders, I realized that man didn't exist anymore. Rachel West greeted me first. She was polite, her voice smooth like glass. She said, "Good morning, Mrs. Armitage," even though she knew I wasn't one anymore. My lawyer, a tired man I'd hired last minute, nudged me to sit. Thomas didn't look at me, not once. He was flipping through a document like he'd been doing this his whole life. His composure made my stomach turn. Rachel began explaining the schedule: custody, property, financial settlements. Her tone was neutral, detached. I tried to interrupt, saying, "This isn't necessary. We can just talk." Rachel didn't even glance up. "All communication will be formal from now on," she said. My lawyer whispered, "Just answer when spoken to." I wanted to snap at him, but I bit my tongue. Then Rachel pulled out a folder and said, "Let's begin with the financial review." She listed assets, accounts, and transfers, everything I didn't know he'd already secured. Every time she read another number, another form, another signature, I felt smaller. My name appeared only as respondent, never spouse. I tried to speak, to reclaim some ground. I said, "He's making me sound like a criminal." Rachel looked at me then, her expression calm. "You made yourself sound that way," she said. "We just collected the evidence." She handed me another folder. Exhibit C, Social Impact Documentation. Inside were screenshots of my posts, public comments, even a short clip from Marino's that had been shared anonymously. My laugh echoed through the room as the video played. I could feel my lawyer shift uncomfortably beside me. I wanted to slam the laptop shut, but I didn't want to look weak, so I stared at the table instead. When the clip ended, Rachel said, "You've claimed in prior correspondence that you were emotionally provoked. Would you like to clarify what provoked your laughter?" I looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes for the first time. He looked at me the same way he had that night. Not angry, not even sad, just done. I said, "It was nervous laughter." Rachel nodded, making a note. "Nervousness doesn't explain repeated public mockery," she said. Ruth had warned me about Rachel, how she was known for dismantling people without raising her voice. Now I understood. Every question she asked was a scalpel. When they moved on to custody, my chest tightened. "Mr. Armitage is requesting primary custody of Emmy," Rachel said. I immediately objected. "He's doing this to punish me." She replied calmly. "He's doing this to protect her stability." I turned to Thomas. "You can't take my daughter," I said quietly. He didn't answer. Rachel spoke instead. Based on the documented emotional environment, the evaluator recommended that Emmy's residence remain primarily with her father. "Emotional environment?" I asked, almost laughing. "You mean because I laughed once?" Rachel didn't blink. "Because you humiliated her father in public, shared personal disputes online, and encouraged violence through inaction." I could feel everyone's eyes on me. The judge's assistant, my own lawyer, even Lydia, who sat in the corner as a silent observer. She didn't say a word, but the disappointment on her face said enough. I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "He's not perfect either." Rachel replied, "No one is," but he didn't make a spectacle of his imperfection. They presented one final folder: property division, the house, the savings, even the car I drove, all reassigned or balanced through formal agreements. The document was already filled with signatures. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "It's clean. You're not losing everything." I said, "It feels like I am." When it was over, Rachel closed her binder. "This concludes mediation," she said. Her tone was soft, final. Thomas stood, thanked her, and began gathering his things. He didn't look back at me. I asked, "That's it?" He stopped for half a second, then said, "That's it." I tried to sound strong. "You'll regret this, Thomas." He turned slightly and said, "You already regret enough for both of us." Then he walked out, his calm steps echoing down the hall. Rachel stayed behind for a moment, sorting her papers. I said, "You enjoy this, don't you?" She looked at me with that same neutral expression. "No," she said, "but I respect people who finish what others start." When I left the building, it was raining. The kind of light drizzle that makes everything feel unfinished. I stood under the awning, watching him cross the street to his car. He didn't look back once. I drove home in silence. The house felt like it belonged to someone else. Boxes were already half packed from the appraisal. Emmy's drawings were taped to the fridge, one of me, one of him, and one of all three of us holding hands. I stared at that last one for a long time before tearing it down. Later that evening, Ruth called. "How did it go?" she asked. I said, "He won." She said, "It's not a contest." I said, "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because you built your worth around being right, and he stopped playing your game." I wanted to hang up, but her voice stayed in my head. He stopped playing. That was exactly what it felt like. Like the silence that used to frustrate me had become his weapon. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch surrounded by boxes, papers, empty glasses. The legal copies were stacked neatly on the table. Armitage versus Armitage, dissolution of marriage. The official stamp at the top looked so harmless, so clean. I ran my finger over the seal, half expecting it to smear. It didn't. Before bed, I found an email from Rachel's office. A short note confirming the finalized agreements. At the bottom, it said, "Mr. Armitage has requested no further direct communication. All matters are resolved." Resolved. Such a polite word for destruction. I stared at that sentence until the screen dimmed. Outside, rain hit the windows in soft, even patterns, calm, rhythmic, final. And for the first time, I realized his silence wasn't emptiness, it was precision. Every quiet moment I'd mocked had been preparation for this. He hadn't raised his voice once, but somehow he'd managed to drown mine completely. The official court hearing came 2 weeks later. By then, my nerves were raw. Every day felt like waiting for another blow I couldn't see coming. I tried to act calm for Emmy, but she could tell. Children always can. She asked one night, "Are you and Daddy friends again?" I told her, "We're still a family." She said, "He said we're two families now." I couldn't answer. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, as if the right outfit could make me look like the kind of woman a judge would believe. I chose a pale blue blouse, and the black skirt Thomas always said made me look professional. It was pathetic. Even in that moment, I was still thinking about what he'd like. The courthouse smelled like paper and fear. My lawyer met me at the door and said, "Keep calm, answer simply, and don't interrupt." I said, "I'm fine." He said, "Don't act fine. Be respectful." I hated his tone, but I nodded. Inside, Thomas was already there with Rachel West. He looked collected, almost serene. Lydia sat behind him, her face unreadable. When he turned briefly, I caught a glimpse of him. Thinner, sharper around the eyes, but steady. He didn't flinch when he saw me. Rachel began by summarizing the case. Marriage dissolution, property settlement, custody review. Her voice was clinical, but each phrase cut deep. She spoke about consistent emotional volatility and patterns of public humiliation. I wanted to protest, to explain that I was only reacting to neglect. But every time I opened my mouth, my lawyer's hand brushed my arm, a silent warning to stay quiet. Then she introduced the evidence again, the same cursed folders and clips. The restaurant footage played on a small screen at the front. The sound was low but clear enough. Damon's punch, my laugh. The room felt smaller. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that the video didn't show everything. It didn't show the years of me trying, the loneliness, the endless silence. But none of that mattered in legal terms. When Rachel finished, the judge asked if I wanted to respond. I stood, hands trembling, and said, "I'm not proud of what happened, but you can't reduce a marriage to a single mistake." My voice cracked. I was desperate to feel alive again. He shut me out. Rachel said, "Mr. Armitage did not shut you out. He asked for honesty. You responded with humiliation." The judge nodded slightly, jotting something down. My lawyer tried to redirect the conversation toward financial arrangements, but the energy in the room had shifted. Everyone could sense it. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a slow, methodical burial. Then came custody. That part hurt the most. Rachel outlined a stability plan, weekdays with Thomas, weekends with me, until further review. She spoke about emotional consistency, parental behavior, household environment. It was polite language for what everyone already knew. He was the safer choice. I whispered, "He's taking her from me." My lawyer said softly, "He's not taking her. He's protecting her." When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate. "I want Emmy to grow up in peace," he said, "not in the middle of conflict." He didn't look at me when he said it, but I could hear the quiet ache in his tone. The kind that comes after you've stopped hoping. I couldn't hold back anymore. "You're painting me like a monster," I blurted out. "You know I loved you. You just never cared enough to show me anything back." The judge's gaze lifted. Rachel didn't interrupt, but I could tell she wanted to. Thomas simply folded his hands and said, "Celia, love isn't supposed to humiliate." The room fell silent. Even the judge didn't speak for a few seconds. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "We've heard enough." Papers shuffled. I stared at the floor as the final recommendations were read. I caught only fragments. Custody awarded, shared visitation rights, financial division complete. My name came up once, briefly attached to the word respondent. It was over before I could even process it. When the judge left, everyone began to stand. Rachel gathered her documents neatly. Lydia came over and hugged her son. My lawyer mumbled something about next steps, but I wasn't listening. I just kept staring at Thomas, waiting for him to look at me. He didn't. I said, "That's it? That's your revenge?" He didn't turn. He just said, "No, Celia, that's my piece." The simplicity of it made me dizzy. I sat back down as everyone left. Rachel was the last to go. She stopped beside me and said, "You should start over somewhere quiet." Her tone wasn't cruel, just tired. I walked out of the courthouse an hour later, into the bright, indifferent sunlight. Reporters weren't waiting. No one cared except me. The world had already moved on. When I got home, there was an envelope on the kitchen counter, my copy of the final order. On top of it sat the keys to the car and a note in his handwriting. "For Emmy's drop-offs, please don't call me. We'll coordinate through counsel." I sank onto the couch, the papers shaking in my hands. The language was clinical. Irretrievable breakdown, irreconcilable differences. But every line felt like a personal insult. Later that evening, Ruth came by. She looked around the half-empty living room and said, "You didn't fight fair, and he didn't fight at all. That's why he won." I said, "I thought I could get a reaction." She said, "You did, just not the one you wanted." We drank in silence for a long time. When she left, the apartment felt enormous and hollow. I kept reading the order again and again, hoping the words might change. They didn't. Sometime after midnight, I took out my phone and scrolled through old messages from Thomas. The last one before everything fell apart said, "Please, let's talk before it's too late." I'd never answered it. I'd been too busy showing him I was stronger. Now he didn't need to talk at all. The next morning, I found another email from Rachel's office confirming that property transfer and custody adjustments have been finalized. There was a short postscript. "Client has relocated to a private residence. Contact not permitted, relocated." It hit like a door slamming shut. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the space where his coffee mug used to sit. I realized that for years I'd mistaken control for love and silence for submission. But Thomas had been planning, waiting, building his exit the same way he built everything. Quietly, carefully, completely. And when he finally left, he didn't just walk away. He dismantled the entire stage I'd been performing on, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for me to stand on. The final decree came in the mail a week later, sealed and official. I knew what it was before I opened it. The envelope sat on the kitchen table for hours while I circled it like it might burn me. When I finally tore it open, the words stared back. Final judgment of divorce. Everything looked so clean, so bureaucratic. No emotion, no history, just lines of text confirming what I'd refused to believe. He was gone, legally and entirely. It listed every decision. Custody awarded, property transferred, communication restricted. My name appeared less than his, and only next to the word respondent. It sounded like something in a report, not a life. I read the pages again and again until the words blurred. There was no mention of the restaurant, no description of the night I'd laughed. It didn't need to be there. The paperwork itself was the consequence. Later that afternoon, I started packing. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. The walls were too white, the air too still. Every photo frame seemed to stare at me. I took one down, the picture of our wedding day. He looked the same in it as he did in court. Calm, sure, focused. I looked younger, careless, almost smug. I slid the photo into a box and taped it shut. Emmy came by that evening. She ran through the rooms, confused about why her things were missing. She asked, "Are we moving?" I said, "Just for a little while." She nodded but didn't smile. She said, "Daddy said you're going to live near the park." I didn't have the strength to ask how much he'd told her. I just said, "Yes, near the park." When I dropped her off later at Thomas's new place, he came out to the car. It was the first time we'd been in the same space since court. He looked different, lighter somehow, like he'd shed a weight I was still carrying. I said, "You're really not angry?" He said, "No, anger's heavy. I don't need it anymore." I wanted to say sorry, but the word felt too small. Instead, I said, "You planned all of this?" He said, "You planned the performance. I just finished it." Then he thanked me for bringing Emmy and went back inside. The drive home felt endless. I kept seeing his face, not vengeful, just steady. The same calm he'd had when Damon hit him. Back then, I'd thought it meant weakness. Now I saw it for what it was, endurance. When I got home, the apartment looked emptier than ever. Half the furniture was gone, packed up for auction. I poured a drink and sat at the table, reading the decree one more time. The final line caught me. Case closed. So simple. So final. That night, Ruth called to check on me. She asked if I was okay. I said, "He won." She said, "No one wins in these things." I said, "He did. He got peace." She sighed. "Then maybe you can too." I didn't answer. Peace wasn't something you could grab. It was something you had to deserve. After we hung up, I sat there listening to the silence. The same silence that used to infuriate me. I'd mocked it, filled it with noise, laughter, anything to feel powerful. But now, sitting alone, I realized how powerful silence really was. It didn't need to shout, it just waited until you ruined yourself. I thought about the night at Marino's. The look on his face after the punch, the calm way he'd said, "We're done." I hadn't understood then that he meant more than marriage. He meant my access to him, my influence, my ability to hurt him. All of it ended in that moment, and everything since had been him methodically sealing the door. I turned off the lights and sat by the window, staring at the empty street. Somewhere out there, he was probably reading to Emmy, maybe laughing quietly at something she said. The thought used to make me jealous. Now it just felt deserved. I folded the divorce papers carefully and placed them in the drawer where his ring had once been. The space fit perfectly. For a long time, I just stood there, fingers resting on the handle. Then I whispered, "You win, Thomas." But even saying it out loud didn't feel right, because it wasn't really a victory. It was just consequence. Steady, deliberate, lawful. When I went to bed, the silence was complete. No voices, no arguments, no laughter. Just the kind of quiet that finally made sense. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.